So we noticed, my neighbour and I, that residents were complaining on social media. And what was of particular concern were the reported symptoms: nausea, vomiting, asthma, headaches, and eye irritation. So I had a conversation with my neighbour, and he said there are potentially carcinogens in the air from the old gasworks site. So if I can explain, the gasworks produced town gas. So up until the 1970s, from the 19th century, coal was burned to produce gas, and the gas was stored in the big gas holders that you see around London. Lots have been dismantled, but some still exist. So burning coal actually caused various chemicals to leach into the soil. So the gasworks is an 88-acre site, and back in 2017, a property developer called Berkeley Group started to remediate the site by digging up the soil and treating it with bioremediation, insects and lime, in what they called an open air soil hospital. So it was only the highly contaminated soil that was taken off site. The vast majority was actually treated on site. Next slide, please. So what residents also experienced and still experience today is indoor air pollution, despite closing doors and windows. And back in 2018, Ealing Council called in Public Health England to actually review Berkeley Group's air quality data. So they came to two main conclusions: that the air pollution from the site was unlikely to cause indoor air pollution, and also the air pollution was unlikely to have a toxicological effect on human health. And we dispute both conclusions. There were times, personally, I experienced the odour within my home, and I would have the windows and doors shut during the day because I was at work, and I'd return home from work and it would smell like, I would describe it as a bitumen melting pot and a petrol station combined. It was so strong at times, I can actually remember the World Cup in 2018, and England were playing their quarter-final, and it was a very hot day, and I picked up my children from school. We returned home, and the odour was so bad, and it was far too hot to sit inside with the window shut, that we actually left home to spend the evening with a friend, and we actually stayed away overnight. Yes, residents have also experienced dust deposits on windowsills, kitchen counters and floors, and we're particularly concerned for young children who have a tendency to touch, their nose and eyes, and we worry about the ingestion of harmful chemicals. And another source of exposure is dermal exposure. So on the site, there is now a playground in the park, and we are very concerned that if children start digging up the soil, they might be exposed to contaminants. We've also experienced noise, at times unable to enjoy our gardens. Lots of residents, particularly those who live along the boundary of the site, being unable to hang out their washing. And it's not just the physical health impacts I described earlier on. We also experience mental health trauma as well. It's very distressing not being able to enjoy your home in the way that you intended it to be. And it is actually a case that some neighbours have experienced their family members being unwilling to visit. And this impacts particularly the elderly residents in Southall, that their young grandchildren stay away. Southall Broadway is ranked as the most polluted road outside of the ULEZ. So this was analysis done by the Environmental Defence League, and it was based on computer modelling. So we have for many years suffered high levels of air pollution from vehicles, but this is now combined with the air pollution from the former gasworks site. Next slide, please. The nearest school to the site is Blair Peach Primary School. And it's been documented in the minutes of a meeting that staff and students experienced headaches and asthma. And in the same minutes, it was also documented that the site manager for Berkeley Group site was appointed as a co-opted governor. And we have strongly argued that this was a conflict of interest and was designed to really mute and deal with complaints about the odours internally. We campaigned very strongly on that, and the site manager probably only served about 2 years of the tenure that he could have served. So yes, it was very noticeable that there are gasworks in the vicinity of the school. We campaigned there during the summer holiday, I think it was 2018, and the odours were very, very potent. And we actually made a film which we shared on our Facebook page about that particular experience. On the other side of the site, Featherstone Primary School complained about odours, and the head teacher at the time, back in 2018, he appeared on BBC London News and said, "I'm so concerned about the children's health, I actually keep them in at playtimes at times when the odour is very severe." There is another school which isn't in the London Borough of Ealing, it is in the London Borough of Hounslow, but very close to the boundary of the site. And we were told that on one particular day, the school nearly closed due to staff absenteeism, and that was linked to the effects of air pollution from the site. Next slide, please. I would say that what is going on is a case of environmental justice. And we tend to think of this just happening in the global south and where the phrase was coined in America, but it's happening right here in London. So we don't have distributive justice. We are predominantly a brown and black community, and we are disproportionately affected by the air pollution from the remediation of Southall gasworks. Procedural justice. The Environmental Protection Act isn't protecting us. Ealing Council won't serve a notice for statutory nuisance. So it doesn't matter, in our view, how many times residents complain and how many complaints are documented. They will not go down the road of legal action. Recognition. Our experiences of indoor air pollution aren't believed. We were told by Public Health England that the air pollution was unlikely to cause indoor air pollution. And the authorities won't investigate our health issues despite numerous documentation and references to the health symptoms that I've talked about earlier on in our Facebook group. Next slide, please. Right, I'm going to sort of bring in demographics, particularly for those of you who are unfamiliar with Southall. So we've got a population of around about 28,000 based on the 2011 census. So approximately 3/4 are Asian. Around about 60% of the population was born outside of the UK. So arguably, Southall is an immigrant town. Southall Broadway has the lowest proportion of white British residents, and 93.7% of Southall Broadway's population come from a Black, Asian and minority ethnic background. And a slightly lower figure for the Southall Green Ward, 91.4%. Next slide, please. Around about 35% of the population are Sikh, about 24.9% are Muslim. Hinduism is around about 18.6%, and Christianity 12.9%. Not a huge differential between the percentage of male and females, but the statistic I really want to take away, I want you to take away tonight, is the proportion of people who cannot speak English well or at all very well in Ealing is significantly higher than the England average in all wards. Southall Broadway and Southall Green have the highest proportions, over 15%, followed by Dormers Wells ward with just over 11%. And the reason why I want you to focus on that, English language, or the inability for a resident to express themselves clearly in the English language, dealing with the authorities such as Public Health England, the Council, and the Environment Agency, makes it very difficult to articulate a complaint if it's difficult to express in the English language what exactly is happening. Next slide, please. There is a very high level of deprivation in Southall. The area scores very highly on the index of multiple deprivation. So male life expectancy in Southall Green is significantly lower than the average of Ealing, London, and England as a whole. And Southall Broadway and Southall Green has the highest proportion of deprived households. Again, what I want you to take away from this is there are real people. We are not just statistics. I actually live in the Southall Green ward, and I live in arguably an overcrowded household. I live in a one-bedroom flat as a lone parent with my 2 children. Next slide, please. Yeah, the most significant areas of health deprivation are found in extremes of west and east. So Southall is an area where there are particular health deprivation and health inequalities. So the wards with the lowest household income include Southall Green and Southall Broadway. And there is a negative correlation between household income and deprivation. So the lower the income is associated with higher levels of deprivation. And because I live in Southall, I see the deprivation when I walk around. When we were campaigning, people would open their doors and you could see, from the interiors of the homes, how deprived they were. And also I used to work at the local college, and I worked in student services, and that gave me very significant exposure to students who needed to claim benefits and student support. So this is the reality of life for many residents in Southall, struggling to keep their heads above water. And obviously today they have greater challenges with the rise in inflation. Southall Broadway, Southall Green and Norwood Green have the lowest wellbeing index scores. We tend to have a high rate of diabetes. Residents from a Black and Asian background are more predisposed to type 2 diabetes. Next slide, please. Another health issue that is quite prevalent is asthma. And Ealing was ranked 5th out of 32 London boroughs on the London Inequality Asthma League table. Many years ago, I used to be a parent governor at a local children's centre. And I don't know if any of you have been a governor. You get a lot of statistical reports before committee meetings and full governing meetings. And certainly the statistics I remember was the rate of asthma in Southall, and it was a particular issue. And it was something that meant that many children's centres had an asthma nurse who would actually deliver services. Next slide, please. So nationally, 30 children a year die from asthma. And in Ealing, there have been 3 deaths in school-aged children from 2016 to 2018. Don't know the breakdown for Southall, but obviously that is a concern, particularly in light of Ella Kissy Deborah passing away and her mother campaigning very vociferously on air pollution and the impact that it has on young children who are particularly vulnerable to the effects. So in 2017, Ealing's CEG commissioners were concerned about the asthma rates in young children, and this resulted in funding for an asthma specialist nurse, as I've sort of referred to earlier on, to deliver specialist services. So in comparison to white ethnic groups, South Asian ethnic groups are 3 times more likely to require hospital admission, and Black ethnic groups twice more likely for asthma. Next slide, please. I think the slide before. Thank you. There has been arguably some progress as a campaign group. We have always campaigned for independent air quality monitoring. And in November 2021, the council commissioned an independent air quality monitoring contractor, Ricardo AEA. So we have now an air quality monitoring station and 2 additional sensors, plus around the site, diffusion tubes monitoring volatile organic compounds, or VOCs for short. The air quality station and the air sensors are monitoring PM 2.5, PM 10, nitrogen dioxide, and some other air pollution as well, but I can't remember off the top of my head. But this is, potentially quite groundbreaking to involve the community. And one of the things that we want to do as a campaign, because the air quality monitoring data is now available on the Air Quality in England website, is to actually hold seminars so that the public can be educated about the impact of air pollution, and also, equally importantly, is to be equipped with the skills to actually interpret the data to understand what is happening. Next slide, please. Yes, as well as the seminars on air pollution, we are supporting Brunel University, who are rolling out a soil study to local primary schools. So potentially that's quite interesting if they're able to do it in the schools closest to the boundary of the former gasworks site. We also want to produce and disseminate leaflets which explain air pollution and the air quality monitoring in a user-friendly way. Because I confess that, sometimes I look at data and I think, well, what does this actually mean? What's the outcome I'm supposed to really take away from this? And I was explaining to Science London in a pre-meeting that I remember seeing a billboard for, I think it was the British Heart Foundation, and they had this individual drinking a 5-litre plastic container of cooking oil. And the takeaway from that was that if you eat a packet of crisps every day, you are ingesting 5 litres of oil. And that was enough to put me off eating crisps for a very long time. But I would like to find a way to make graphic and accessible to people that air pollution is an invisible killer. It is a serious risk to health, in the same way that we comprehend the notices on cigarette packets that smoking is a serious risk for lung cancer. So we hope to be able to speak at more events. So it's been wonderful to talk to you tonight. And we will go on organising protests with GCU as well as cash protests. And we also want to influence Virendra Sharma, who set up an all-party parliamentary group, or APPG for short, on gasworks redevelopment. The inaugural meeting was held last April, so we're pressing him to hold the second and follow-up meeting. Next slide, please. So I'd just like to say thank you very much for listening to me, and I look forward to taking your questions in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Angela, for taking us through the kind of backstory of CASH as a campaign, and the health socioeconomic and racial inequalities that are being faced by local residents. And I feel like a lot of that also really did come out in the video and the pre-conversations that we've had about this as an emergency situation, but is often not spoken about in that way. And also the potential role that science and science communication has in supporting the work that you're doing to campaign against Ealing Council. So thank you so much again for speaking with us, and we'll kind of come back to more discussion as part of the Q&A. I'll now hand over to Araceli, who doesn't have slides, so I will stop sharing my screen. So Araceli, over to you. Thank you very much.
Cool, thank you. So I'm going to piggyback on some of the stuff that Angela was mentioning, but also start to look at the conversation from the lens of a scientific practitioner. So the first ask that I was told by Angela to cover is the phenomena of susceptibility, or the science of air pollution. So air pollution is not only distributed unequally, it is also felt and experienced biologically and psychologically very differently. So people that are already susceptible, there are some people that are more susceptible to air pollution. For example, a person that has depression, diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular diseases, it is well known that their bodies are in what is being described allostatic overload. Otherwise, can be described as a deregulation of multiple systems, including the stress response. So this could mean that a person, even at very low levels of air pollution, can still be acutely and highly affected by air pollution, which gives us the pathway to discuss what do we mean from a scientific perspective, or from a, let's call it from a procedural perspective, right? Because science is a process. When we are coming into a community and we are simply looking at levels of PM 2.5. So that's where I want to anchor the next part of the conversation and getting some of those definitions. So PM 2.5 is simply a metric. It's like saying an inch or a centimeter or a gram, etc. It has nothing to do with the particle, it's the particle size, but it has nothing to do with what that particle is. So you could have a various array of toxins that affect the body in various different ways, but it's measured in PM 2.5. So just to measure the quantity of PM 2.5 isn't enough in order to tell the story of how that is affecting health. The second thing is that you're measuring air pollution. And this is being conflated in the scientific work of organizations like the Environmental Agency and the now defunct Public Health England. But in general, of some of the scientists that I see working within air pollution, is that they're creating a false equivalence of saying, oh, there's a PM 2.5 amount of X, therefore the health consequences are Y. That is not scientifically accurate. It's not good science. You cannot take a metric for measuring air pollution and without any normalization of the data or further analysis say that that means anything in the realms of health, especially as there is no formal definition of what health is. So if there's no formal definition or scientific breakdown of what health is, you cannot then say X amount of air pollution equals this amount of good health or this amount of poor health. So there is a revision that has to be done within the science to serve communities better. But why? Why is that the case? There is a really dope book. I thought I had it in front of me, but I don't. There's a really dope book called Pollution is Colonialism. And the author there talks about a concept of the right to pollute. So this concept started in the 80s by two scientists that, they got so elated. They were like, look, rivers can self-regulate and clean themselves naturally, which is true, whether it's reed beds or seaweed or cyanobacteria or currents or rocks, whatever it is, rivers have a very good system, natural system, to be able to get rid of themselves of pathogens, contaminants, etc. But what happens is if you're constantly contaminated, the river does not have the time to be able to get rid of those said contaminants. So instead of these scientists looking at the ethics of the pollution of a river, and also significantly, what the pollution of the river means for the health of an ecosystem, including biodiversity and non-human biodiversity, they just said, well, we're going to create this formula based on the fact that a river can self-regulate. We're going to create a formula of how much contamination can be sustained in the river before there are health consequences. But this didn't take into consideration that contamination also means, as Angela says, could be noise. It also means smell. So the people living by those rivers being contaminated either by pesticides or other industrial toxins, they've got to smell this. And we are geared towards identifying salient stimuli. We are made, all living organisms, plant, bird, us. We all have the mechanism to observe the environment, understand where there's a salient change, and then what to do about said salient change. So our instinct when we smell something putrid or something that is of bad odor, of course, it's going to send the relay systems, the biological ones and cognitive ones, to go, there's a nuisance there. That process of identifying that there's a nuisance, being aware that there's a nuisance, is actually a stress. You are already putting that community, that set of people, into the pathway of poor health, at the very minimum of discomfort. And that baseline that was created in the 80s of, again, doing those false equivalencies, you're measuring something that's happening in the river and how the river is being contaminated, and boom, you're going to extrapolate that all the way to a human scale, quite frankly, is stupid. It's just not good science. I can't articulate that enough. That has stayed with us in policy, because look, people were so happy. They're like, cool, so I can contaminate the river to X, yes, and thus making it legal. And that baseline, that framework, that epistemology in the way of thinking of pollution in relationship to the health of people has not left us. A, Centric's trying to break that down, but B, all of us have the duty to question these fucking systems that have been laid out for decades and go, why are you arriving to these conclusions? Especially when these conclusions are completely contradicting the lived experience of these communities. What are you going to do? Call an entire population, an entire community of people liars, or like they're imagining their symptoms? That's not possible. It is more, can't think of a word except for asinine. It is more contradictory and asinine to think that all of these people are in some conspiracy making these symptoms up than the fact that a contaminant, a new change into the environment, is having zero effect. Which brings us to the next point. There is nothing in our environment that comes in and has zero effect. You open up the window, changes in the temperature, you're going to feel a different sensation. Colder, more comfortable, or hotter. You take a drink of water, you become more hydrated. There is no entering stimuli into your system that has zero consequence. That is not how biology works. So to even contemplate that there's going to be a change in an environment where there are new pollutants, new toxins coming into environment, and it's going to have no effect, again, it contradicts the laws of nature, not even the laws of science, the laws of nature. The other thing to consider, again, with this baseline of the right to pollute, is that this is a gaslighting tool. It's an oppressive tool. So we have to think about marginalization and racism as an ecosystem and as a system itself. It's got processes, it's got knowledges, it's got strategies to keep on keeping on. Therefore, us as scientists who are working with these types of communities, we too have to update our processes and our strategies and our knowledges to be able to do the science that is needed for these communities. So this is where the contradiction came in. So I'm going to give you a very clear example. I'll give you two examples. So one, the Public Health England did a data study. One of the data studies was, we are going to check by the GPs how many people were coming in with changes like diseases. Surely the GP will start seeing asthma, diabetes, et cetera, that are consequences of air pollution. In the last 3 years of the development being put in, they saw no correlation. That was one of their metrics to find out if there was a link between the site and the people. Wash their hands, and they were like, cool, no correlation. We did the same mistake. We went down that route too. We were like, okay, hold up. Maybe if we took where these GPs are located, where the air pollution site is, we should see a correlation between the two. But there wasn't. And so then our job wasn't just to go, oh, well, the data is the data. So that's where our job ends, because there were still consequences on the ground. So we found out how GPs work. And we found out that GPs only record and can only record when a person has something diagnosable. So if a person was coming in, let's say with a panic attack, because that also started happening within the community, or with a headache, with nausea, but there was nothing to tick in the box of, oh, this lack of breathing is now asthma. This uncomfortability in the chest is now hypertension. Without that disease being diagnosed, nothing was being recorded, nor were the initial symptomology and changes that the body was taking being recorded. There was no recording of, oh, the community has been complaining of chest pains, of nosebleeds, of headaches, of nausea, of changes in sleep. None of that was being recorded by the GP. So then that data is unreliable, and we have got to do better science and understand those inner workings of society that affect our scientific work. We can't just walk away. The other thing is that for the very acute symptoms, i.e. when there was a respiratory problem, when there was a heart attack, well, that goes to the hospitals. The hospitals, then we can't correlate that data. So again, we have no information. So we were like, okay, well, we can't use that either. The second example is that they said, okay, cool, we're going to check absenteeism among students. Surely, if there is all of these symptoms that are happening, absenteeism in children in the school is going to rise. Intelligent enough hypothesis. Again, no correlation. But that's where they wipe their hands, because instead, when we looked at that, we're like, well, what would cause a negative correlation there? What are people doing there? What's a life like in Southall where that would change the relationship between the two data sets? Upon meeting with Angela, upon getting to know the community, we found out that the community mainly is a shift work economy. That prevents, and we were told by a mother, I send my kid to school no matter what. And so there again, the data sets weren't correlating. And the thing that's upsetting is that gaslighting, to go back to the community with such gravitas and with the science, like this whole scientific institution and knowledge supremacy, to go and gaslight an entire community and tell them what you are observing, your millennia worth of instinct and biological knowledge that your body has to tell you that something is wrong in the environment, we are going to negate that, because we are going to operate on, like I said, the right to pollute. It's under X amount, it's under the WHO mandate, therefore, what's the name, Barkley, you're good to go. That is the right to pollute. That is not a health right. And that's what we're trying to work with people at Southall and with other communities to change that narrative, to go from the right to pollute to a civic right, the right to breathe clean air, which brings me to the next point, that we need to ask not for cleaner air, but clean air. And those semantics are very important. When we say we want cleaner air, we're playing to the semantics and to the baseline of the right to pollute. When we ask for clean air and we define what clean air means, which includes nourishing air, i.e. access to microbes that are essential for our gut system, then we are in the track that we need to be. And we're moving more to a civic right and moving away from the right to pollute. Okay, so now moving away from specifically the story of Southall into the bigger way of, or the more macro, sorry, of how does Centric work with communities. So first of all, we no longer use the term engagement because it is now so synonymous with telling communities that they have to engage in this cause and that cause, when communities are more than engaged. We get change through communities. That has been historic from day one. Any civil rights that we have, any changes that we have, they are always, community driven, because the government is not the one that's going to give us those rights, it's the people. So whether it's a voting right or whether it is gay rights, they are all coming from communities. So to tell and go into the presumption that communities are not engaged in the injustices that they are experiencing is ignorant. So we no longer use that vocabulary. We talk about an equitable collaboration with communities, and we set forth a set of principles. There are 9 of them. I'm not going to go through them. Y'all can go to our website and find them. The highlight, and one of the ones that I really like, and that it came from one of our colleagues, Charlotte, was active and continual consent. So you don't just ask consent once. You continually ask and update that consent. Is it still okay that we're collaborating with you? Is how we are doing our science still serving you? Is the way that we are conducting our rapport with you still comfortable? Because if it's not, we got to either revise it or retract. And also that we live with, if the community just says, no, thank you, then it's no, thank you, we peace out. Because otherwise it's creepy. And another one that I really like in our principles is knowing that whatever question that we have is probably a question that the community has already asked. So going in and co-designing the question of investigation, which we did with Angela, and also designing the experimental process. So in terms of our work with Angela, we had a lab book that the whole community could access, an open lab book that we were making, I think sometimes daily, sometimes weekly updates of, this is where we are in our investigations. And we would have, I don't know, what do you think, like every 2 weeks we would have meetings at the very beginning when we were producing the report, Angela, of just catching up with Angela to go, this is what we found out. this is where we're stuck. So we're now going to go this way. Are you still cool that we're going to go this way? And she would be like, yes, no, actually, can you go, can you add this? Can you subtract that? So we were in constant communication with Angela and the community to ensure that the entire process from beginning, the questions that we were asking, to the data collection process, to then the writing of the report, was all in line with what the community needed. And then that brings us to the last bit of other things to consider. We cannot go in for the satisfaction of our grant, of our PhD, or our postdoc. That is not fair to those communities. So Cancer Corridor is heavily studied by epidemiologists. On the one hand, fantastic, but on the second hand, none of that research in the last 10, 15 years that Cancer Corridor has been done has changed any policy, because those scientists piece out. They go in, do their jam, get the postdoc, get the book, whatever it is that they get for themselves, and then they piece out. And they're not there on the ground advocating, fighting for, look, maybe there's exceptions. I shouldn't be so mean, maybe some, but for the most part, I don't see scientists then advocating and protesting and joining the groundwork of the environmental justice part of it. And that's not right. That's colonialism, shenanigans, and that is part of you just coming in. And you can be brown and also come in with colonial shenanigans. Do not get that twisted, because we can. And that's not fair, and it's not ethical. And then the final thing is that we need to get off our high horse as scientists. Science is a process. It's not just a profession. And science is such a instinctive process to all of us as living beings, because it's asking a question, it's observation, it's revising that question, it's experimenting, and it's iteration. All that entire scientific process, that's how a baby learns cognition, right? It drops shit on the ground and it goes, oh, what's that sound? Does it break? Does it bounce? What is that? And the baby iterates and it learns. So Angela often says, I'm not a scientist. I don't see anything in that presentation that Angela did that doesn't have scientific prowess behind it. Her process was already scientific. When we spoke to her, she already had a lot of data. She already had a lot of information collected. Her instinct was, there's a change in the environment. I'm going to go ask my neighbors. I'm going to go and document that. I'm going to go and create questionnaires. That is the scientific process in motion. So in this working with, collaborating with communities, it's not also just coming in and us going, okay, I'm going to go and do the data collection. We're going to do the data collection as scientists. It's also knowing how to work with the data collection that is already happening within that community. Maybe it's written on a napkin. I mean, that's what some of the people in Cash said. I'm writing stuff down on receipts, on napkins. That is still data, and it's still usable data. And us then maybe as scientists that have the processes in place and the mechanisms in place, that's our role, is the fact that we can take this data and add other procedures and methods that are translatable to those that make policies. That's our role. And so in that, it's to be able to understand that data and what to do with that data, rather than, oh, let's start from scratch and we're only going to do the data the way that we have it and within our own structures. Because again, otherwise that's not collaboration, that's not consent, that is just coming top down and enacting knowledge supremacy and erasing the intellect, the scholarship, and the science that is being done by the communities. Okay, I'm done.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Araceli. Thank you to Angela as well, both amazing presentations. I'm going to facilitate a bit of the Q&A. So just to kick us off, I know that there's going to be loads to talk about. I have lots of questions I want to ask, but obviously I'm going to facilitate the audience asking questions. So please do drop some questions in the chat. And I just want to reflect just for a short moment on especially the kind of things that we've heard from Cash and Centric Lab working together and the things that we can take away. There are a lot of calls to action there as scientists, as science communicators, as people who will be working with communities. And I think now's a really good time, even if you don't have any questions, to sit and reflect on the need as scientists to get off our high horse, the need to, you said in a meeting that we had to prepare, Araceli, I'm not sure if you said it just now, like we need to think like humans, not like scientists. So this idea that like the data doesn't match the experience, the data is wrong, not taking away from experiences. So just some great things to think about.